Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another in the series, Curating Culture. I'm Georgette McGlashan Miller, Research Fellow at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank. Education is often cited as the key to success. Yet, by our own metrics, the 2024 Caribbean Education Secondary Certificate exam revealed a troubling crisis. We had a regional failure rate of 94%. Today, under our title, Education for What, we will be speaking with Isabel Dennis. Isabel Dennis is a lifelong learner and educator who is driven to create a safe and just world in community with others. Drawing from her family's tradition of alternative education, her PhD research explores indigenous Caribbean learning systems. Through Learning to Live Knowledge Hub, she designs interactive workshops that challenge the status quo using play and conversations. Help me to welcome Miss Dennis. So, Isabel, talk to us about this 94% failure rate.
Right. Well, that's the start, right? That's the first start. Every time I start by telling people that, this year in 2024, June exam, there was a 94% failure rate. People can't seem to understand. They can't wrap their minds around that idea. And I understand because it's a story we've been told, right? To get your passes, get a good job, and then you live life. Life is good, right? But how many of us have gone through that and life is good, like good, like everything sets. It's not like that, right? So what we realize, what I'm working through is that story in everybody's head kind of plays a major idea. And so anytime I give them information, and you would have seen, oh no, we can cut to the register and CEO of CSEC who actually said this out of their own mouth so that you could see for yourself that I'm just not making it up. It actually happened and it is real.
So, we are going to go to that clip now with the evidence.
As to the acquisition of 5 subjects or more, we recognize a certain percentage, about 6% of the entire population of persons registered for the exam getting 5 or more. When we indicate and do further probing, we recognize that when we make the restriction, 5 subjects, including mathematics and English, that drops to 4.9%. What that tells
Right. So that was Dr. Rajdi, and he was basically saying that 4.9% passed this year and received a full certificate. Now, what a full certificate is, for those who don't know, is 5 subjects inclusive of English and math, right? So only 4.9%, not even 5%. And that means like in a number of 100 people, 5 people passed. And in the Caribbean region, what that means for us living is that only 5 people out of every 100 people would be able to get a minimum wage job. Only 5 people out of 100 people will be able to go to tertiary education. So I'll let that sit with you for a minute, because that's 5 out of every 100.
It also says that only 5% of the Caribbean CSEC population got 5 subjects, at least 5 subjects.
Inclusive of math and
Inclusive of math and English.
Right. So that's what we call a full certificate. So only 5 out of every 100 people can go to tertiary education and can get a minimum wage job this year.
All right. So before you get more into the stats, explain to me your title, Education for What? Because I remember when we sent out the flyer, people misinterpreted, or people had different interpretations, I should say, of education for what, meaning why should I get education? And you know the recent dance theme going in Jamaica, as well as what are we being educated for? So which is it if there's another interpretation, and how does that tie into these metrics?
So it is the second one, which is what is education for? But it can also easily be like what we're doing, right? And it depends on the perspective, and we'll get into that a little later, because the perspective of certain people, it would be, okay, well, what is education for? And then other people, it would be, well, why do education in the first place? Because we know the system set up to fail. So some people are aware that the system is set for you to not pass. And other people are like, well, no, I'm just going to get an education, get my passes, get my job, and I'm set. And so when we're talking about, as we're exploring ideas, it's really important to think about from which perspective we're looking at, and who is the we that we're talking about, and when we're talking about that, right? And so both of them would be like part of the conversation, because they're both equally valid and very necessary. And I happen to actually be covering both of those questions, the answer to both of those questions in this conversation. So both of them is everything. It's everything plus.
But your research is saying, or what you're saying that you discovered in your research, it's that we shouldn't look at it as a failure rate, but that we are getting the result of what we put in. We are getting the result of our education system.
I'm going to walk you through this story. So the story that some of us have is that you get an education, you get your 5 passes, your full certificate, then you get your job, and then you're set for life. And given that story, then if we have a 95% failure rate, but 95% people don't pass, then that should alarm the people who have created this, to be like, listen, we need to stop everything what we're doing, and we need to start over, because we are actually not doing what we're supposed to do, right? If you have a 95% failure rate, like your business is losing 95% of everything,
it's bankrupt and shut down.
Right. So why hasn't it shut down yet? Why hasn't education shut down? And if you want to complain and say, okay, well, I know people might be like, all right, well, it was after COVID, we're still recovering from COVID. But in 2017, the then register did it, because Jules also said the same thing. He said, we are failing our children. And he said this. So it's from since 2010. And if we keep going back and back and back, we'll find more evidence to show that this didn't just happen because of COVID. This is not a new thing.
Getting that for years now concerning the results for math. And as you said, if it was a private business, they would have been out of business.
Right. Yeah. So what I want to show, I want to walk us through some of the background, right? Because we have part of the story, which is the main story, right? And what's behind that story? That's what we're going to go through. And as we get into what's behind of it, then we'll start to see where my research falls in and how it ties into the education for what, right? So CSEC, for people who don't know, is secondary, it's called Caribbean Secondary Education Certificate, right? And it's a series of school leaving exams that's organized by subject, right? So at the end of 5 years, everyone in high school or secondary school takes an exam, well, a series of exams, and those are by subject. And what happens is that when we look at which countries, not all Caribbean countries take this exam. So which countries take this exam is really interesting, and we can pull it. Yeah, because not every, and so it's the English speaking Caribbean, right? Okay, great. But what is the English speaking? Which are the countries in the English speaking Caribbean? There's 16. Well, 18, right? And if you can pull up the slide, you'll be able to see These are all of the countries, right? Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, Belize, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, and we go down the line, right? And if we go back a little further than CARICOM, before CARICOM, these are all the countries that were part of the British West Indies, save and except two, which is Bahamas and Bermuda. So the countries that were governed by the British in the colonies, so the colonizers, British colonizer came and was like, okay, these are the colonies, these are my territories, and this is how we're going to educate. And then CXC, which is the governing body for CSEC, came and said, all right, well, these are the countries that we'll be running the education for. So they basically took over exactly from the same thing. The only two differences, two countries are not Bahamas and Bermuda are not part of CSEC.
Political thing, a social thing, a cultural thing.
And so if we say, okay, well, first there was the British West Indies, and Britain was doing their education. We need to think about, okay, now, well, what was their philosophy? Why
Oh.
did they need education? What was the reason for education for what? Right?
So it's a philosophy of education that we're getting to.
So we need to because we have to tap into, right? In order to answer your question, you have to know what's the history, and then you have to go back and figure out, okay, so well, why? What is the reason for it? Because people don't just do things because, and it doesn't stay. Even if you do things because, it does not stay for long because it's not if it doesn't serve a function and a purpose. You ever try starting a business? Hello.
Yeah.
All right. So the philosophy behind the British education system was that in Barbados and in Jamaica, from the time the British came, they had schools because British came in Barbados first and got opened up schools. Then they went to Jamaica second and opened up. Great. So after that, those schools were only allowed European settlers, kids, the children of European. I don't want to be settled.
Creole that were here to teach their children
Right.
first.
And I don't even think it was British Creole. The mixed up ones, I think it was just the ones that came with their parents to come and take control over this space. And so they had their schools. That was the first thing. And then all of a sudden, in the 1830s, Britain got very concerned about all children. And all of a sudden, Britain decided that they needed to educate all children.
Is colonization is until you look like us as close as possible in language, in dress, in all of those things.
The interesting piece is what else happened in the 1830s?
There was emancipation in the 1830s, wasn't there? 1838.
The abolition of slavery happened.
Right.
1834 it started, and then in 4 years later, it was like there was apprenticeship, and then it ended. And so the 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 end of slavery is linked to the start of education in the British West Indies. That's when Britain decided that they cared about all children. But the
Okay.
thing about it is that they didn't necessarily care about all children. This was specific to African children. And when we get into it, and you'll see on this slide, John Sterling, Reverend John Sterling, said basically that, specifically, like exactly, I'm not paraphrasing, that we have now removed the whip and now we need to control the minds of the African through education. And this was the person who was in charge of organizing and getting the education in the British West Indies for the Negroes.
Wow.
And that was specific. That was exactly, the slide will have it, the quote, exact quote. And so education for the Negroes in the British West Indies was to replace the whip and to control the minds of the African population.
Say that again. The
Ed-
education in the British West Indies was to replace the whip and to control the minds of the African children. I've never heard education discussed from this point, being connected to our CSEC results.
so when you think about it now, if that's where it started, and I would even give you more information, just to lay it on real thing. There was a Negro education grant that started. So there was something called the Negro education grant, where the British paid two-thirds of the cost per African child for them to be educated, and they gave it to the churches. And so that's the connection between church, state, and education.
I thought you were going to say that's a connection between the churches having the schools. So most church have a basic school, and then most of the high schools are connected to a church.
Yep. And
Okay.
that's how that was where it paired, and that's how it continued. Church
Yes.
and education, but the state funded it, right? The state funded the church to be able to educate the children. And so, no, not the children, let's be very specific, the African children, right after emancipation, right after the abolition of slavery. So if
You're going to tell us about the nature of the education.
that if that is where the that's where we're coming from. CXC, CSEC, that's the trajectory if we're going back. That's part of it, right? Now if we go back further, we'll find that not not everybody in this space was obviously European. They had Africans, right? And of the all the countries, the CSEC countries, save for, let's see, Cayman Islands, Belize, and another one. I can't remember right now, but three of them do not have a large African population. They have maybe, and
Okay.
Guyana. They have
Guyana.
even, Guyana has a little bit more in the Indian population than African population. Cayman has very small African population compared to white population, and Belize has a very large indigenous population. But every other island in that list of countries have a majority African
Majority
population.
African population.
Right. And so when it is we're thinking about the story of education, and we're only thinking about the education that the European brought into this space, we're missing the story that the African brought into this space. The story
Yeah.
of education that the African brought into this space. And some people are like, well, I'm not African, I'm Trinidadian, I'm not African, I'm Caribbean, or
Or
I'm
I'm
Jamaican, I'm
mixed.
Jamaican.
My
Yeah,
grandmother is from
yeah,
India and my grandfather is
right.
German. And yeah.
Exactly. But what I want us to realize is that the majority of the people came, but were brought from Africa, stolen from Africa, brought to America. Right. So the majority of us all have an African heritage. And that means that there's a story about, when we look at our cultural practices, we can see the connection. There's continuity. There is not that, oh my gosh, all of a sudden the African, now that they have been there's now that there is no more slavery has been abolished,
Right.
all of
No
a
more
sudden,
enslavement.
no more enslavement, all of a sudden the African can now do things. They now
Yeah.
have a
Or
choice.
can
They
now
now
do
have a
things
voice.
how they want or their way.
The African was always living their life and always doing their things and always learning and teaching and growing. And when you look at our cultural practices straight across the region, you will see evidence of this. So I want to talk about For example, sound system culture in Jamaica, or dancehall, or drumming. Pick one, whichever one you want. How did it
Yeah.
start? Who started it?
Right. It started among the people. Uh,
Which people?
without the working class African descendants, right, that wanted to make space for themselves, create their own identity, have their own voices heard, that space. And a lot of it from memory of their African past, African ancestors. Even today, we still hear that in the sounds of the music, in the sounds of the drum, coming up through all our different genres in Jamaica and across the Caribbean.
So there is in each of our cultural traditions that we can trace it back. There's
Right.
continuity. There's continuity in the African experience because African did not just cross the Atlantic and then lose all of their Africanness. They have it. And in different ways, they were able to mold it and shape it and continue it so that reggae, ska, mento are across the world. There's
And
sound
even
system
in
culture.
our, if I may cut you, in our religious spiritual practices, I've noticed that even our Christian expression in Jamaica and across the Caribbean is different from North America. Even the
Yeah.
very clap, the note, the song, it's very different.
Right. And so when we look at all these pieces of evidence and we put this story together, we would see that, okay, before I get into what this story says, were they, what were the challenges that, that just off the top of your head, what were some of the challenges that prohibited Africans from practicing their culture or
Well, I mean,
living
as
like they?
early as the 18th and 19th centuries, they were banning of the drums. Drums were not allowed to be played in public. They had to do it secretly. They had several laws across the Caribbean saying that the drums would disturb the slave masters, the plantations. They were worried about what was happening, about the Africans sending messages, coming together, having community. With the dancehall and the sound system is the best example. There has been several noise abatement acts. Outside of the acts, or I should say prior to the acts, we would have the state militia, which is a paramilitary that would go in and raid the dance, lock off the dance, partially for the sound and partially for reasoning that the dancehall space harbored criminals. Yeah, but
Right.
a part of
Because
it was
anything,
just to break off the community because the
right.
dance served more than a social space. It was also an economical space. It was also a space where you get information, almost like a crossroads where people meet, greet, share
Yeah, we call it
stories.
junction.
Yeah,
We call it
right, a
junction. So
junction, right.
right, a lot of our cultural practices happen in at crossroads, at junctions,
Right.
where the roads met, and so people met in that space.
Right.
Why do you think that? Because that is a part of the cosmology of the African cosmology. There are crossroads, and that's at the point at which one thing meets the other, and as above, so below. There are lots and lots of there is a
It's like the cotton
continuity.
tree.
There is a continuity of African thoughts, ideas, practices, even if we don't label them as African. When you meet somebody and they say, your spirit, don't take them. Like, oh, my blood, don't take them. There are versions of that across the entire Caribbean. There are versions
And
of
I
that.
like that you say continuities because it's a term I prefer to use than retentions.
Mhm.
Right. Because
Because we
retaining
continue. We
sound
continue.
almost like preserving, but the continuity tell you that it's been there all along and it just continues to live.
Yeah, and it's the perspective, which is why we're using language to make sure we place the conversation in a particular place.
Right.
Right? So it's continuing. Africans came and continued living. And in some ways, you could see it publicly, as in the sound system culture and the carnivals and the pan and all that stuff. And in other ways, it's private. But there's all of it is relational. And all of it serves a different function. Now, we may not remember the function, but when we pour libations before we in the bar, we pour countries. But really bad is you see the many colonization. Again, another African retention. And these are all things that we have not been, these are parts of the story. So our story is there. We are living
Yeah.
it. Except we have not acknowledged it. We have not brought it together and said, okay, this is our story from our perspective. And
So you're
so what
saying in our
my
learning we have these same practices. So tell me like some of the African learning practices or philosophies.
that's where we get it, right? So this is where my research comes into play, and I'm like, okay, this is the story. This is our story from our perspective, and our meaning Africa, right? Because we're majority African in the Caribbean, and so this is our story, and this is how we're gonna tell it from our perspective. And these are the similarities I've seen across the region, and the only reason why the violence and the domination and the pure disgusting behavior of Europeans, this is not the way to say it, of Europeans trying to control, suppress, crush the African culture and the African spirit to dominate them did not work because we still have culture, we still have reggae, we still have carnival, we still have, and then when you look in carnival, you see similar characters across the entire Caribbean.
Across
And then
Jonkun is a perfect example.
there you go. And then it goes to Africa. The Dogon tribe has the same looking like features, the same characters. And I say characters, and again, I'm trying to be very specific. It's not really characters. It's a way of being. It's a tradition. It's a sacred practice. If I wouldn't call priests characters, right? In the same way I wouldn't call a priest a character. I'm not
Interesting.
it I have to also correct myself and be like, it's not a character, it's a role in a fully functioning system and way of living. And that's where my research comes in. And that's why I started to say, okay, well, I looked at Kalinda and I was like, oh, which is stick fighting in Trinidad. And I looked at how they taught and learned to pass down this tradition and what were the things that allowed it to happen. And I had the distinct pleasure of learning from King David Matthew Brown, and learning from Rondell Benjamin. Rondell Benjamin helped me into that space so I can really get a deep understanding of this sacred practice and the way that it functions, because it's not just two people getting in a ring and hit each other. It's much more than that because it has to be, if it survives the all the laws, all the violence, all the everything that was put there to squash it, then
Right.
that must be very strong. Like just logically, that what that is not random, and it's not by the way, and it's not some hooligans, just criminals just doing something in a yard. It is there's a something that holds it together, and what
Yeah.
holds it together is the principles and practices and the ways of life and how it functions in community. So it's not just one thing. So for example, if we go back to CSEC, CSEC tells you you need to understand each subject by itself and don't mix them.
So we have
That's not
disciplines.
that, yeah, but that's not how the African worldview is. That's not how we look at things. That's not how we operate. When you're talking to somebody and you're talking in layers. We talk in layers. We don't talk straight. And you have to understand what those layers are. Now we in the Caribbean will understand. And even like south, south of the US, like south,
Yeah.
um, southern US. There's still some stuff like Louisiana and New
Right.
Orleans. They also share some of that because the population, the African people were spread across this whole area. It wasn't limited to one location just in the
You know,
Caribbean.
you said that, and I start to think now about how nowadays they're talking about STEAM and STEM and, mental ability. And I'm like, integration. All of a sudden, they're integrating. There's this high emphasis, I should say, on integrating subjects and subjects intersecting with each other. But in
Yep.
our real lives, we do that on a daily basis. All of a sudden, I hear talks about sustainable development through education. And this is something that would seem common sense to say that if you're going to school, you're being educated for life, for the environment, not just for a particular discipline or a particular area, because all of your life will, I don't want to say conflict, but mix, you know?
Right. And how we live is we live. And so if you ever been to like tertiary education in the region, it's almost like there's conflict between what we know to be true, but we can't explain it in a particular way, right?
Right. You
We
have
can't
to follow a
explain
certain discipline, a certain formula.
it. We
Your
can't
knowledge
explain
doesn't
it.
count unless you, it's like the epistemology. Yeah, the ontology is different. Yeah, I
Yeah.
understand what
So
you're
we
saying.
starting from a totally different
We
place.
have to know it from
And
somewhere else.
exactly. And so it's not knowing from something that's distant to us, it's knowing from our community, from our lived
Right.
experiences, from our dreams, from the things that are from the environment, from our nature, from these are the things. And so when I think about what are these things you ask, it's learning to live, right? It is learning to live. We learned how to live in the environment that we existed in. That's human,
So, all
right?
right, let
And
me
then,
cause some problem then. Are you saying that the education that we are getting through CSEC and CXC is alienating us from our own reality in the way that Lorna Goodinson poem would talk about the daffodils and the snow and all of these things that is not in our environment?
it's it if we why should we understand snow and how it operates in the Caribbean, living in the Caribbean? One of my pet peeves during Christmas time is seeing snowflakes in in Caribbean decorations. Because I'm like, there's no snow, and if there was snow in the Caribbean, we should be very worried. Because
Yes.
that means the world is end. And so for me, it's like we need to learn the things that are able to live the way that we need to live in
To be able
harmony
to
with our
live
environment.
successfully. I
Yeah.
remember doing a course very early with the late Agri Brown. It was some communication course. And he was a bit ticked off about something in the topic that we were learning. And he says we often look at technology as devices and computers and machines. But the man in the woods who cannot reach the fruit on the tree and he creates a pick stick, which in Jamaica we would call a ackee stick, even though it's not only ackees that we pick. He has created a technique to get the fruit, which essentially is a technology that helps him. But because it is so local and it is so, what should I call it, ordinary, we don't see it as technology. But it helps you to survive and to eat, and it's a means to an end.
Yep.
So basic
Learning to live.
education like that.
Yeah. And so and you say basic, right? So I'm going to challenge you on basic education like that. Without those things, how can you live? If today or tomorrow all the ships crashed and stopped functioning, so we could not import food, and Caribbean countries have like the highest import of food bill, what will we do? And how would we live? What would happen? And if technology and
If
electricity
we
stop,
can't import.
if that's one, if we can't import, and two, if we don't have electricity, what's going to
Yeah.
happen? What's going to happen to us? Will we survive? How many of us know how to survive in our environment without electricity?
Wow.
What does that mean? CXC is not teaching us that, because
No,
that's
not
not
really.
no, because it
No.
doesn't meet the agenda. And so the story, the other story that I'm looking at, or the story, our story that I'm pulling together, I'm piecing together, it's a longer story than we have time to really get into. But it the principles, I can touch on the principles of what this story is. And the principles are play. Spell out an acronym called play. Before
Play.
I get into play, PLAY.
Right.
Before I get into this, Tracy has a question online. It says, what the failure rate like in other Caribbean countries outside the English speaking Caribbean? And so my answer to that is that I can I can explain what's happening in the English speaking Caribbean because there's one governing body that gives everybody the same thing. So
Right.
CSEC in Trinidad is the same as CSEC in St. Lucia, is the same as CSEC in Jamaica. Now, if
And
we're
we know
talking about,
last year when they had leaks, the leaks of the exams across the region.
right, yeah, so we can measure and speak to the failure rates in that bubble. Outside of that bubble, we're going to have to find new metrics to be able to figure out how do those exams compare to CXC exams and what that looks like. And I haven't done that research, so I would not be able to tell you what that looks like outside of the English speaking Caribbean because there are many other different types of exams, and so we're not talking mangoes and mangoes. We're talking mangoes and breadfruit, and so we
Okay.
can't really we can't really put those together. So just to get that out of the way. So back to play,
Right.
play. So the way the acronym I use is play because not every, a lot of the cultural practices that I have experienced and I'm exploring and trying to deepen my understanding with talk about play. They talk about like stick fighting. They're not stick fights. They're stick fighters. They're bois men. They're bois men, which bois in French is stick, right? So they're bois men. They're not really stick fighters. They play stick. They don't fight stick. You play mass in carnival. You don't
Right.
dance or jump mass or anything. You play. So a lot of the things that when the people who are the practitioners, the people who are the experts in this space, talk about it. They talk about play, and I'm using play as a play on words. Play.
Okay.
So that's one, play from that perspective. Two, play if we want to go to the academic in the fault of the academy. Play has been cited as the fastest way to learn something is through play. And so there's the trend, a global trend when we're talking about education and trying to think about education. Oh, education, this is a fun thing. Education is fun. This is a fun lesson. This is yeah, because they're trying to to align themselves with that idea, that research, that play was fastest way to learn. So if we make education fun, then they would learn faster, right? So that's two stories. And then the way that I'm using play as an acronym is as just as a guide. So any of these things that I'm doing and any of these spaces that I'm creating, I'm thinking about the activity from me personally to institutionally. I'm thinking about these things and I'm thinking, are we playing? So are we standing in our power, right? Like, where do we have power and what does that mean? And are we standing in it? Are we using all the power that we have at our disposal? Are you standing in love? What what does it mean to love and to act out of love and to make decisions out of love in this space at this moment? Are we aware or attentive? What are we paying attention to? Are we paying attention to story A or story B? And how does that shape the decisions that we make and the story that we're telling? So what are we being aware of? And then why are we yielding enough to be able to see the picture, to see the multiple stories, to be able to understand and get the deeper understanding? So that means we're not going fast. We're not speeding down the road. We're not going Mach 5, Mach 10. We're not doing that because we are giving ourselves enough time to be able to be aware, to figure out what it means to love in space at this point in time, and to figure out where our power lies and how we can use our power to the benefit of the community. And so for me, play is the answer. And that's the methodology in a nutshell of what I'm exploring and figuring out of my research, out of all the different things, then we need to play more. And we need to play more in all senses of the word because we'll learn and we'll be able to build community better if we're thinking about who has the power, where's the power lie, and how are we utilizing power? How are we operating out of love? Are we aware? What are we aware of right now? And are we going slow enough? Are we yielding to be able to make all these decisions to the betterment of our community?
You know, you
And
say that, and the one phrase that comes to my mind is Rex Nettleford's inward stretch, outward reach. And my mind also goes back to the COVID-19 period when persons were very skeptic about which vaccine to take, if any vaccine at all. And a lot of people expressed that they would prefer to take the ones from Cuba because they were closer to us than to take the ones from North America. But it's just to show how we've been educated in not looking to ourselves and to our traditions, not looking inside. Though I know a lot of people, a lot of indigenous groups that decided to make their own vaccine and, you know, express their own practices in keeping themselves safe. So with this education thing, it's you're going to get some challenges with playing. I mean, a lot of people are going to find it difficult to see past the acronym play, right? But it is something worth exploring, seeing that the results from the traditional education system has been giving us the same failure rates, and every year it's just a higher number, just a higher number. It is similar to these violence prevention programs that they have in schools. You know, the PALS fail, the, what was the other one? Some emotions, cells, social and emotional learning. And a lot of them fail, not because they're not good programs, but because they were lacking Jamaica's cultural perspective and input. You know, the way how Jamaicans live. So you take something from North America, like you take something from Europe, and then you impose it on our children, and there's no integration. The program cannot work. And again, with education, something like homeschooling. I remember when I tried to homeschool for the first time, I was told by relatives that, you know, the teacher at school is more educated than you. They are trained. You're not trained, you know. But I find that my brightest child is the one that was homeschooled, right? Because the level of critical thinking and the level of independence and helping yourself, you know, and that is what a lot of our students void and what they're trying to call mental ability and trying to push into the school now. You can't make somebody think. You have to put them in a situation where they can think,
yeah.
you know, instead of trying to memorize and regurgitate and all of that.
Right. And so Sally online has said that some of the pushback that you had already just mentioned, Sally's saying, well, you know, what CSEC has been in operation for 30 years. It's actually like fifth there because it started, CSEC started in 1972. But what I want to say is that the 94% failure rate this year didn't start, and maybe you jumped in late, Sally, but the 94% failure rate didn't start this year. It's been happening over and over and over again, year on year. And when you go back and you look at where these things came from, then we'll be able to have a really solid understanding, which is why I started where I started in this conversation. Because if I were to start with C people would not be able to even like how you can tell people to play and we feel get it like it feel
Yeah.
that. It's not that. We have to go through the emotions and look at these stories and then start exploring these stories again from a different lens, from a different perspective, because they're the way that you tell this story, the way that where you start this story impacts who's the villain and who's the hero, what's the strategies that work, what strategies don't, and what's the end result. Because if you start this story at colonization, then you're missing thousands and tens of thousands of years. That's not where the story starts. These stories start way before. There were people living in the Caribbean way before. And so if you have to have a decent understanding of what's happening and where we come from to be able to understand where we came from and where you want to start this story, and then how we're going to use the information that we have to tell a new story. And so I encourage people to like, people are like, okay, well, what next, right? So yeah, we have a new story. African people in the Caribbean have a way of living and operating, and you say it's through play. All right, okay, fabulous. How do we do that? What does that look like? What are the practical steps? And then how do we get our children to pass the exam? Right?
Right.
Because it kind of loops back to passing the exam. And I understand the fright of many people with the fact that they need their children, or we need to continue the conversation and the story that they need to pass the exam. I know many people who did not pass the exam who have been able to go back and do it again, because there's no limit to how many times you can do a state exam. Like there's no limit. You can do it at 99. Literally, you can do it at 99. And
Okay,
so,
Isabel, I'm going to see if we have any more questions online. I know you took one from Tracy, one from
yes,
Sally.
exactly.
Producer,
And
what else
then
do we have? I'd like to ask you, when do you plan to wrap up this research and when we can see something tangible, or
right,
tell me about your workshops?
right. So the next, like what's next? My research has been in conjunction with my lived experiences. Everything that I'm saying, I have been, I think Chelsea's asking, have I implemented in schools? I've implemented it with students that are being homeschooled. I've implemented it with students that are in schools and not and coming to me for classes. And so I have seen how it has been used, how it has been able to give all my students confidence and allow them to express themselves much, much better. And when they interact with the adult world, my kids, because I call them my kids, when my kids interact with the adult world, adults are like, what? How can you express yourself like this? What is it that
All
what
right, let me interject here now, Isabel. Culturally, in Jamaica, they have this saying that say, children must be seen and not heard. So a mouthy child is considered to be feisty, or you're force ripe, or a lot of negative terminologies. But I find that that is only among a certain class of children now, where even the parents reinforce that type of negative thing. You talk too much, you're going like you're big, you're not encouraged to express yourself, even to critically think about things. So you're prime.
well,
So when you have these children, and
spoken, yeah. So
people don't
sometimes they don't
appreciate the conversation, or them being able to have a good conversation or to think through and respond for themselves. If they say something that is not trained or rehearsed, it is a shock.
at 17 or 18, 16, 17, 18, whenever you finish school, the day that you get your passes, You're expected to move from asking to use the bathroom, asking for permission to use the bathroom in school, to being able to lead your life, your whole life, and to be innovative and to save the world. Like
Yes.
children will be able to, young people have the answer,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you
It's
never.
like when I started UE and I asked a question once, and the lecturer said, "But I don't expect that of you. I expect tertiary thinking." And my response to the lecturer was, "But I'm here to learn." So
Right.
you don't learn critical thinking at primary or high school, but you come as this Insta university student.
And you're
Yeah.
supposed to know. And so moving from needing permission to go to the bathroom to leading your whole life, that's a big jump. And without practice, we are failing our students in that way. And I think that for me is more important and more crucial than the failure rate of CXC. Because I know
Okay.
a lot of people who, let me just finish this. I know a lot of people who have not done CXC at the prescribed time, went back and did CXC, and then they're fine. So there's it's not one story. It's not one way that you can do things. There are lots of different ways. And to get back to Chelsea, yes, I am working to put it into a school to see how it works in a school setting. Looks like I need to make sure that I have the information to be able to do that. And I've been able to do it one-on-one and small groups. And so, yes, the next step is to jump into a school.
Okay, so my final question from Gordon Productions. It might have been asked before, but this person is asking what can be done to increase the pass rate in each country? Maybe Gordon did not hear the play suggestion, so you can summarize.
Well, the answer to that question, Gordon, is a long answer. There is no short answer. I mean, okay, the short answer is know thyself. You need to know thyself and then help our youth remember themselves. Because when we don't do that and we try to fit them into a box, they get lost. And then when we expect them to, well, how you wouldn't do this? And that's crime and that's this and that's that. But you told me to follow instructions. You've trained me to follow instructions without question. You've trained me to just follow whoever has the most power and could insert the most violence towards me as a person. I'm just supposed to listen. Just when you said, Georgia, children are supposed to be seen and not heard because we're supposed to make sure that we have control over them. So now, if you have children in that space for so much time, then when they have to think, then what are we asking? How can we expect them to think? How can we expect them to go into an exam and feel comfortable and confident if everything outside of the exam has told them that they're dunce and they're stupid and they can't? And you could argue with me about that's not the case, but we have the 94% failure rate. So then what is the case? Like, what is the evidence to support any other reason? And I'm welcome to hear it, I really am. But based on what I've understood and the history of our space and what I've been understanding about the other stories that exist in our space, we're doing the passing of CSEC is not the whole picture and it's not the whole story. And so, what I would suggest, I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'm happy to explore with anyone who is interested. And if you're thinking about, okay, well, what is this play thing and how do I put that into practice for myself? You can go to learningtolive.info/pledge and that'll set you up to take the pledge and to figure out what it is and how you can and figure out those practical steps because there's some people who are like, okay, yes, great, how do we do this? And so that's how learning to live.info/pledge, and that's where you can start that process with me. If you're just like, okay, well, where can I find out more? That's the same place where we'll be able to get more information, and we can continue the discussion because it's not just my version of the story. And it's not just Georgette's version of the story, and it's not just Sally or Chelsea or Gordon's version of the story. It's our version of the story. And how do we make sure all the voices are in the space in a way that is useful for the community, in a way that it can last? And we have proven methods that have existed for hundreds of years in the Caribbean that we can tap into. And the method that I'm suggesting is through play, but there are many other ways, right? There are many, many other ways. And so I leave you with that as one, practical ways of moving forward, and two, an understanding that it's not just what Isabel says, but it's what we say together. And I have piece of the information, and Georgia will have piece of the information, and everybody will kneel, and just everybody have piece of the information. And so how do we make sure, how do we gather ourselves to get all our information and then figure out what works for us as a community?
Okay, thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you to the audience online. I'm sure this was very thought provoking, probably irritating for a few people, but you know, we definitely have things to think about, and we have lessons to learn, lessons to relearn, lessons to recreate as well. And you know, education for what? What exactly? You know? So until the next time on Curating Culture, where we curate to educate. This is our last show for the year, our Christmas show. We are going to go on break in January. We will be back in February with our AYA program at ACIJ, where every Thursday in February we have an event. But more current, on December the 10th, we will be having a film screening, not the flat screen, in collaboration with the Embassy of Colombia. We'll be looking at the film Saturio, The Last Executed. So if you're on our mailing list, you will get more information about that. If not, drop us your email in the comment below. And until then, join us again on Curating Culture, where we curate to educate. Thank you.